Hey guys, welcome back into the Wells Tech Garage for our first class of 2017. We're changing it up a little bit today. You can see we're starting in the shop first of all. We're starting working on the vehicle, and then we're going to end up going into the classroom to do classroom stuff. Yeah. So before we get into what we're working on today, Fritz, and what we're doing for the class, why don't we give away that T-shirt? I think Definitely. It's that time.
Oh yes. Like some of you saw our last broadcast, we have 3 colors now.
All right.
Black, the blue, and the gray. And make sure you specify which color you want when you win, because if not, Mike is going to give you whatever he's got the most of.
Perfect. So being that we have all these cool colors now, I figured we might as well make the question just a tad bit harder.
Yeah, the last 2 you gave were a little too easy.
A little too easy. Yeah. Okay. So this is still going to be an ASE style question, guys. So here we go. Technician A says, a vehicle with a positive 25 long-term field trim and a negative 25 short-term field trim should not be driven, and it needs to be fixed immediately. Technician B says, a stoichiometric air-fuel ratio mixture provides optimal performance for gasoline engines. A little bit harder, right?
Yeah.
All right, so go ahead and chat in your answer in the little comment box there. A for Technician A, B for Technician B, C for both technicians, or D for neither. We'll see who gets it right.
Okay.
And hopefully, guys, by the end of the class, you'll know the answers to the questions if you didn't know it already. All right, so today we're going to be talking fuel trims, right?
That's correct.
We're going to talk air-fuel ratio, fuel trims, O2 sensors, mass airflow, map sensor, everything that the computer kind of uses in a system, a closed loop system. And we're going to get into open loop and closed loop and all that stuff, explain all that. For some of you guys that have been doing this for a while, it might be a little bit of review. But just stick with us, because we got to start at the bottom. We got to start with the basics, right?
Yeah, especially with this, because on a few lean codes, it could be anything on the engine causing a problem.
Right, and that's exactly what this thing has. Our vehicle here has got a P0171 and a P0174. By the way, what are we working on today? What is this thing?
Oh, this is a little race car.
All right.
It's our 2004 GTO with a 5.7 400 horse.
Wow, LS1 motor in there.
LS1.
It's a fun car to drive when it's running, right?
Yeah, that's true. When it's
right
running,
now, it seems to be lacking a little bit of power, a little bit of rough idle. Yeah. Check engine lights on with that 174 and 171. And we'll get into those codes in just a few minutes here. So yeah, we can't just go ahead and dive headfirst into this thing, right? Because it's not a code like a cylinder 3 misfire or a map sensor circuit code or a transmission solenoid A code. We don't really have any pinpointing location of where to look, right?
Exactly, because it could be anything on the engine.
It could be anything. I mean, there's just so many things that can cause lean codes, so many things that can cause rich codes. We need to understand the system before we go diving in head first.
That's
before
right.
we go to fix something. We have to know what we're looking for. Without an understanding of the system, it's hard to do your job, right?
That's right.
Just like when we hook up a lab scope. Without knowing what diagram we're looking for, it's almost impossible to know if that lab scope image is good or bad.
That's right.
So I think it's about that time to go teach a little bit on some fuel trims and air-fuel ratio. So I'm going to head over into the classroom area, and I got a presentation prepared over there.
Yep, and I suggest you guys pay attention too.
All right.
Right.
Because this is good stuff, right?
Yes, it is.
I got a little science project too.
Yes, you do.
It's going to be a fun one. All right, guys, I'm going to head over there. You going to go take a nap?
Yes, I'll turn this thing off and go take a nap.
Okay, sounds good.
All right.
All right, we'll see you later, Fritz.
Yep.
All right, guys, lots to cover today, so I guess I'm just going to get right into it here, because we got to talk about fuel trims, and we need to understand exactly what we're looking for before we can go, onto the vehicle with a smoke machine or any other tool like that one comment was about there. So let's get right into it. First of all, guys, up front, we need to understand that there's not just a fuel trim sensor. So you throw a 171 lean code, you throw a 172 rich code or something. You can't just go to the auto parts store and ask for I need a rich sensor, I need a bank 1 lean sensor. It's not like that. We have multiple sensors and multiple components and multiple problems that can all cause these generic type of codes. Think of your 170 through 175 codes. think of them kind of as the health check on the motor. The computer's saying that the motor's not running healthy at that moment, but it doesn't know what it is at that point. So, field trim related sensors. We got things like our oxygen sensors, pre and post cat. Those are going to be our biggest contributors to our field trims, and that's what the computer's going to watch the most. Things that are going to affect that: mass airflow sensor, map sensor, engine coolant temp, and intake air temp are all going to have factors on the way the fuel strategy is done on this vehicle and the way the field trims are done up inside the computer. So, sorry if I talk kind of funny. I got a cough drop in my mouth. I got this cough that I just can't get rid of. So, let's talk trouble codes. P0170 through P0175 are going to be all of our fuel trim codes. Starting with 170 is for bank 1 through 172. These are all bank 1 codes for lean and rich on bank 1. If you have a 4-cylinder engine, you're only going to see bank 1 codes. Like our GTO with the V8, we have 2 banks, so then we get into 173 through 175 for our bank 2 codes. So if you guys are ever thrown off when you're looking at codes like this or oxygen sensor codes, if it says bank 1 on a 4-cylinder, that just is the only bank. They just label it that way because that's the way they do it. All right, also related codes, oxygen sensors. Misfire codes like your P0303, 306, you know, those type of codes. Key thing to remember here, guys, remember that the codes that are set can cause other codes. They can cause other problems. So you run into a lean condition, can cause a misfire. You run into a misfire condition, it can cause a lean condition. So these things can kind of build on each other. So our, our rule of thumb of the lowest code number, always start with that, kind of might not work here because say we get a car in with a P0301, P0302, and a 303, and a bank 1 lean code. Where do you start? What do you do first? Do you look at the misfire first? Do you look at the lean codes first? It's kind of a toss-up. So by understanding how the system functions, we should be able to have an idea of where to go. All right, things that can cause lean codes. This is just a couple of the things. In all reality, this list could probably go on and on and on, and you guys probably have stories of some really wacky vehicles out there that cause some really weird lean codes that were incredibly hard to find. These are the common ones. Coolant temp sensor. Your coolant temp sensor is reading hot. Let's say it's reading 200 degrees, and the coolant temp is really only 50. At that point, the computer would want to be adding more fuel in because of the colder temperature. So, therefore, the system would be running lean. The fuel pump or fuel restriction or plugged up fuel filter, something like that, is not allowing fuel pressure to get high enough to, what am I trying to say here? The low fuel pressure can cause it to run lean because there's not enough volume of fuel then flowing into the cylinder, so the computer isn't able to get enough fuel, so therefore it runs lean. An injector not opening, similar thing. That cylinder's not able to get any fuel, it's going to run lean. Map sensor or mass airflow sensors, they are going to be, if they're skewed, they're not able to properly read the amount of air coming in to the engine. Therefore, the computer doesn't know how much fuel to add. Can cause it to run lean. Fuel pressure regulator leaking excessively. Now, this is an iffy one because a fuel pressure regulator leaking a small amount can cause a rich code. So this one kind of goes both ways. If it's leaking excessively, we're talking like the fuel pressure regulator is actually creating a vacuum leak on the motor because that vacuum hose is tied typically right back to the intake manifold. Ignition misfire. Any sort of misfire can cause a lean concern. Ignition especially, but misfires in general can cause lean or rich conditions depending on what is causing the misfire. And then the big one, the one that most of you guys have all run into, is vacuum leaks. And now, and exhaust leak before the O2 sensor. Any sort of air getting in to the exhaust system before the O2 is going to obviously skew the O2 and cause lean conditions. But let's get back to vacuum leaks, guys. Vacuum leak in a quick, easy definition. A vacuum leak is going to be any sort of air that enters into the intake manifold that is not being metered by either the map sensor or the mass airflow. So typically, mass airflow sensor cars are going to be a closed up system. So you have your mass airflow sensor here right by your air filter. Air is going to rush in and it's going to go past that sensor. As it's going past that sensor, the computer's reading what volume of air is passing past there. Now, if you have a hole in that air intake snorkel, if you have bad intake manifold gaskets, if you have a cracked PCV hose, if you have a brake booster that's failing, that is all going to draw air into the intake manifold and give you unmetered air, air that didn't go past the mass airflow inside of your engine. Computer's not going to be able to know how much air is in there, so it doesn't know how much fuel to add. You run lean. And last but not least, head gasket problems. Coolant leaking into the cylinders, that kind of thing can cause lean concerns as well. So, lean codes. They're going to be probably the most common fuel trim, fuel issue related codes. I would say probably like a 75 to 25% ratio between lean and rich codes, with about 75% being lean from what we see day to day in the shop. Rich codes, like I said, less common, but you can see we have temp sensors or what it is, if coolant, oil drip on it, that kind of thing. See a lot of corrosion and resistance inside of those ECT connectors. That can cause the same problem as a skewed coolant sensor. That higher resistance, computer will recognize that as the sensor reading cold. So watch for skewed ECTs for rich codes. Fuel pump, again, fuel pump creating issues. If your fuel pump is over pressurizing the system, so say we're reading 70 psi instead of 50, okay, that can cause a rich condition. It's going to allow more fuel to enter into the cylinder. Because remember, the computer is only controlling the on time of the fuel injector. So if we turn that injector on for 2 milliseconds or something like that, at 50 psi, it's going to squirt a certain volume of fuel inside of that cylinder, or on top of that valve, or whatever fuel injection system this has. But say you up that fuel pressure, let's say we're up to 70 now. That same amount of on time, that 2 milliseconds, is going to give you a greater volume of fuel. More pressure being pushed behind it, it's going to spray out more fuel if it's held on for the same amount of time. That's where that's going to create a rich code. Again, MAP sensor, mass airflow sensor causing rich codes. The fuel pressure regulator leaking slightly. Now this is that fuel pressure regulator with the vacuum hose on top. If it's leaking slightly, that vacuum hose is just sipping fuel all day. So by sipping all that fuel, putting it in the intake, you just gave it more fuel inside the intake, it's going to run rich. EGR valve slightly open, plugged up exhaust, failed evap system. This is a good one. So your evap system is failing. Kind of like that vehicle that we worked on, would have been last year, that 2010 Focus that had that 2.5 liter four-cylinder with the failing purge solenoid. If you guys remember, that car actually had lean codes and rich codes in it. And the way that system had failed was the evap system's purge solenoid, which is connected directly to engine vacuum, was stuck open. So on initial failure, the vehicle was running lean because it essentially had a vacuum leak. It was drawing all the air out of the evap system, sucking it into the intake manifold. Now, as that system kept drawing vacuum on the entire evap system, it started to actually draw raw fuel out of the gas tank, up into the charcoal canister, and eventually into the purge solenoid, and in the end, into the engine. So that's how an evap system can cause either a lean or a rich condition. Dirty throttle body, and then of course a leaking or dripping fuel injector can cause your rich conditions. Okay, so we're going to get into a little bit of history here just of where this all started out. Back in the 70s and 80s, before I was born, you guys started seeing computer-controlled cars. Fortunately for me, I was raised in computer-controlled and fuel injection, so I didn't have to go through this change. But this was brought on by the government, by emission standards, by the fact that our vehicles were polluting so much back then that the emission standards came about. We saw OBD1, which evolved into OBD2, and we started seeing 5-gas analyzers and emissions testing and IM200 tests, that kind of thing at your emission stations. Just as a side note, guys, I read a really interesting article a couple weeks back saying that even though every year our vehicles being sold and on the road in the US are increasing, the pollution and the emissions output of those vehicles for the first time ever last year actually went down. So our vehicles are becoming increasingly more eco-friendly, so it's good for the environment. All right, so to understand fuel trims, fuel trimming, how the computer is adjusting all that, we need to understand the basis on which all of this information is formed and calculated inside of the computer. In comes air-fuel ratio, or air-fuel mixture, or the amount of air and fuel that are entering in to the cylinder during a combustion event. And we call that basis stoichiometric. That is what the emission standards have decided for a gasoline engine to be the exact amount of air and the exact amount of fuel we want inside of our engine to create the least amount of emission gas. So we're looking for gasoline, 14.7 parts of air to 1 part of fuel. Diesel is close, 14.5 to 1 part of air. Ethanol, 9 parts of air to 1 part of fuel. And hydrogen, a whopping 34.3 parts of air to 1 part of fuel. That's a crazy high number. So these things here, a higher ratio, so talking 14.7, 34.3, the higher you get, the leaner the mixture, the less fuel is required to mix with air. The lower the ratio, the more fuel it's going to take. So this is actually why ethanol vehicles typically don't get as good a fuel economy. We're seeing about a 25% loss in fuel economy on an E85 vehicle versus standard gasoline. Because it takes the same amount of power to, or excuse me, it takes more fuel to create the same amount of power. Okay, this also comes into play. Let's talk about like drag racers for a minute. They're using like alcohol fuel, that kind of thing. They're running like a 4-to-5 ratio, talking too fast, a 4-to-1 ratio or a 5-to-1 ratio, because at that point they're dumping so much fuel it's actually helping to cool the cylinders. Same things with guys who are running ethanol in their high boost applications, turbocharged vehicles, supercharged vehicles. They want to run ethanol because they're running extra fuel through it. The fuel is cooler than combustion temperature, so it's actually helping to cool the cylinders down. So that is why air-fuel mixture is so important. Now, in front of us here, we have a little, I want to call it a science experiment. It looks like 6th grade science class right here. We got some food coloring and some glasses. What I'm trying to show you guys here is air-fuel ratio. So in these little ones right here, I have 1 part of fuel and 14.7 parts of air. So what I did, I just took and marked a line on here for 1 part and dumped 14.7 of these into our glass right there to give us 1 to 14.7. So this is a stoichiometric mixture right here. So let's call this it's called a 2-liter engine. This is a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine right here. You know, not a lot of fuel, not a lot of air being inside of each cylinder during a combustion event. Then we bump over here. Let's call this a 6-liter V8. It's got a little bit more fuel and a lot of bit more air. You can see there's a huge difference here. But guys, what I want you to see is the fact that this right here is the exact same ratio as this. Okay? 1 part of fuel, 14.7 parts of air. All I did with this was I took this one here and dumped 3 of these into here, giving me a 3 times the size, so a 2-liter to a 6-liter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys what we're trying to achieve on a stoichiometric mixture. So we're going to dump in our air. All right. And we're going to dump in our fuel. And we'll see it mix, and it's going to mix inside of the cylinder. And there we go. We have our stoichiometric mixture. And we'll just call green being stoichiometric. So 14.7 parts of air, 1 part of fuel gives us a green, happy mixture. Green for the environment. There we go. Same thing over here, guys. 14.7 parts of air, unless I spill some when I dump this. Oh, there it goes. Okay, we'll call it 14.6 parts of air, because I did spill some. And then we'll dump in our 1 part of fuel. Okay, here we go. It should look the same. And there we go. We'll mix this one up a little. Yeah, I don't have stir sticks. Got to use mechanics wire. The joys of being in a shop. All right, so you can see these look exactly the same. Obviously, there's going to be less volume in this one because a 2-cylinder is going to use less volume of air and fuel than a 2-liter is going to use less volume of air and fuel than a 6-liter engine. But don't think here that I'm saying that this is exactly how much air and fuel goes into every cylinder on every combustion event on a 2 liter, also with a 6 liter. It doesn't always gulp this much air. There's this thing called volumetric efficiency, or VE. And in all reality, guys, VE should have its own class. I'm just going to talk briefly on it here just so you guys can get a quick understanding of exactly what I'm talking about. But, okay, so that was air-fuel ratio. So let's talk VE. Volumetric efficiency is basically going to be the percentage of air. It's going to be a percentage value for the actual volume of air-fuel mixture entering into the cylinder compared to the theoretical amount of air entering into the cylinder. So before we get into the rest of this, let's look at what we have in front of us here, guys. Pretend this is our cylinder on our 2 liter motor. This is our cylinder on our 6 liter motor. If I were to look at this and tell you which one was more efficient, I would have to be saying that our cylinder is more full on our 6 liter. I would say that's probably about 95% efficient right here. And that's because the cylinder size, because the size of the glass, that kind of thing. This isn't real world internal engine, obviously. But I would call this cylinder would be full if it's at the brim, and we're slightly under, I would say 95% efficient. But if we look at our cylinder here on our 2 liter motor, you can see we're not even halfway. I would call that maybe 40, 45% efficient. And really this is unrealistic because chances are that motor's a lot more efficient. An engineer who designed a motor like this probably wouldn't have a job for very long. But to get my point across, guys, this is basic volumetric efficiency, is how much air and fuel is going into the cylinder versus how much can theoretically be inside that cylinder. Now, I'm saying 100% is full, okay? There are ways to get over 100%, and that involves pressure inside of the intake, either by specially designed intake and exhaust manifolds, which takes a lot of engineering. VVT helps with that a little bit. And the big one, though, guys, is forced induction. Turbocharged motors, supercharged motors, motors that are supercharged and turbocharged. You know, that helps to increase this, so we're actually going to pressurize whatever's inside of our cylinder to allow more air and more fuel to get in there to create more power. Now, volumetric efficiency is probably going to be the #1 reason we're seeing motors nowadays creating more power. You know, back in the 60s, you had an 8.1 liter motor, you know, a 400, a 450, you know, big block motor, huge, huge engine displacing all kinds of air, but only creating 300 or 400 horsepower. Nowadays, you can get a 2 liter motor and you can create almost that much power by using a supercharger or a turbocharger and upping the volumetric efficiency of that engine. Therefore, it requires less fuel, more fuel efficient, while still making a huge, huge amount of power. So, volumetric efficiency's #1 and 2 factors on what, excuse me, what attributes to that: temperature and RPMs. Temperature, because air is denser when it's colder. There's more, I guess, oxygen molecules, right? Denser air would have more oxygen. There's more dense air at colder temperatures. As it gets hotter, it isn't as dense. And RPMs, because it's got everything to do with valve overlap. So this is, you know, part of why you see guys in the tuner world that are putting dry ice in the air boxes and that kind of thing. They're trying to make denser air to get higher volumetric efficiency. For those of you guys that like equations and engineering things and that kind of thing, we do have an equation here. I'm not going to go through it because it doesn't help me fix a car. But for those of you guys that want to know, basically our equation is volumetric efficiency equals the actual volumetric flow rate, so the actual amount inside the cylinder at that RPM, divided by the theoretical flow rate, so divided by the theoretical total of what that cylinder can hold, times 100% to get a percentage. So 95% is considered great right now. 95, we're seeing some vehicles up in 100. Naturally aspirated engines on specially designed motors, on test equipment, that kind of thing, they're up over 110, 120% volumetric efficiency on a naturally aspirated motor. That's just insane. That's a hell of a feat of engineering. So I think as we get newer vehicles, well, obviously turbochargers are huge right now, right guys? Almost all vehicles coming out now have a turbo on them. That's to help with this. Okay, so enough about volumetric efficiency. Let's get back to air-fuel ratio. On the screen right here, we have a chart. This is a chart for air-fuel ratio. Remember, the lower the number of air-fuel ratio, the richer the mixture, and the higher the number, the leaner the mixture. So at a rich mixture, at 10 parts of air to 1 part of fuel, we're seeing really, really high carbon monoxide and relatively high hydrocarbons, okay? As we get leaner, it starts to decrease and decrease. And as we get leaner, the O2 levels go from 0 up, 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 and up. So you can see CO and O2 kind of act the opposite, and hydrocarbons do a loop here, and then CO2 kind of peaks right in this range here. So I guess we see this 14.701, that is going to be our emission standard. This right here, that's our sweet spot right there, guys. That's what computers on vehicles are being designed to do, is try to achieve that sweet spot. Try and get the emissions down as far as they can to make our engines as efficient as possible and as eco-friendly as possible. Remember, we're using green here. It's eco-friendly. So that's what we're trying to do, is make eco-friendly engines. Now, is there such thing as a perfectly running engine? No, everything changes. Temperature, load, RPM, fuel quality, water content, volatility of the fuel, ethanol content, all that stuff changes. So we have a variance built in here, guys, and that's what fuel trims are. Fuel trims are our variance, our adjustability. It's the computer's way to react to try and maintain this level. So if we look at this, guys, you can see these two lines right here. I'm going to call that our variance window. That's going to be the window in which our fuel trims are going to vary. Excuse me. That they're going to vary either rich or lean, depending on the conditions that the vehicle's operating in at that exact moment. So a vehicle that might be operating outside of these conditions is probably going to set a check engine light, and we're going to get into that in a little bit here. But like I said, guys, 14.701 is the ideal for emission standards. If you look here, you can see our CO2 peaks a little bit earlier. That is actually an indicator of good combustion. That is giving us an indicator of our premium spot for performance. The actual air-fuel ratio for performance, the ideal spot where you want to be, is more so around like 12.5 to 1, somewhere right in that area. And if you have an engine that's performance tuned, chances are they're going to be moving that air-fuel ratio around because 12.5 to 1 is considered peak for performance. Peak for fuel economy is somewhere typically up around 16 to 1, somewhere around there. We see that a lot on newer engines. We're running more lean. So let's look at a gas analyzer. For you older guys out there who use gas analyzers still, personally I don't. I know how to use it, but I don't know what all this means. I don't spend enough time on it. Some of you guys out there like Fritz, I don't want to wake him up from his nap in the car, but I'm sure he's looked at these things, used a sun machine before, used the gas analyzer. He knows what we're looking at here. I really don't. I understand what CO2 and hydrocarbons and O2 are, but it really doesn't do me any good. I'm a scan tool lab scope type of technician, and there's nothing wrong with either way. If you guys like gas analyzers, keep using them. They're great tools for doing a quick diagnostic on finding out what's wrong with the vehicle. The only thing that I notice in this that strikes me as odd is this lambda number right here. Lambda 1.09, okay? That means something. I'm going to get to that in a minute, so just stick with me. Our 5-gas analyzer, I got just a few quick little indicators for 5-gas. If your carbon monoxide goes up, your O2 goes down. They work inversely of each other. CO, carbon monoxide, is an indicator of a rich running engine. So you see an engine with high CO, it's running rich. You see an engine with high oxygen or O2 content, it's running lean. That's going to be the big giveaway for that. CO2, in most cases, is going to drop if there's any sort of air-fuel ratio imbalance or misfire or something like that. Anything that's causing that engine to not run at its peak level, you'll see a drop in CO2. CO2, again, is going to be kind of our indicator of a good combustion event. High hydrocarbons, low CO, high O2, at the same time indicates a lean or EGR diluted mixture. High hydrocarbons, high CO, and high O2, excessively rich. High hydrocarbons, normal to marginally low CO, and high O2 could indicate a mechanical issue or an ignition misfire. And again, lambda. What the heck is lambda? So, lambda is kind of a funny word, but it's got a real easy meaning for us as technicians to understand. Lambda equals 1, or stoichiometric, or 14.7 to 1. So when you see lambda 1, you can know that that means 14.7 to 1. If lambda goes up, so above 1, it's the same thing as our air-fuel ratio number going up. So lambda 1.2 is equivalent to an air-fuel ratio of about 18 to 1. So lambda goes up, it goes lean. Lambda goes down, it goes rich. Lambda of 0.8 is equivalent to a 12 to 1, roughly, air-fuel ratio mixture. So if we look back at this 5-gas analyzer, you'll see lambda 1.09, excuse me. Lambda 1.09 indicates that this engine was running a little bit lean at the time of that snapshot. Now, lambda isn't only used on our 5-gas analyzers. We see it on current data, on newer vehicles. We see it also in place of O2 sensors. We see lambda as an O2 sensor number sometimes on a wideband vehicle. So we're starting to see lambda more and more. Just know, lambda 1 equals a stoichiometric mixture, or 14.7 to 1. They're interchangeable. All right, let's talk. Oh, this is just a screen grab where we're actually looking, the computer recorded air-fuel ratio for a 99 GMC 5.7 liter V8. We're reading 14.1. We're under stoichiometric, so we are running just a little bit rich on this motor. Now we can talk about fuel trims and fuel trimming and how the computer is adjusting everything, since we have a base knowledge of what we're doing. So the PCM has this pre-set-up idea, this open loop strategy, okay? It started back in the 80s, well, fuel trim started back in the 80s with GM's fuel integrator, which would be our short-term trims, and block learn, which would be our long-term trims. The base fuel strategy, or base fuel table, or the base fuel event for a vehicle is going to be programmed into the engine computer from the factory, but that is only in effect during open loop operation. The PCM then goes into closed loop and changes fuel delivery depending on O2 sensor input and that kind of stuff, and we're going to talk open and closed loop in just a second. When you guys are checking fuel trims, make sure to check at multiple RPMs. And when we get to the vehicle in the next class, we're going to be showing checking fuel trims at multiple RPMs. And the car has to be in closed loop for fuel trims to take into effect. So closed loop, open loop, what are they besides just PIDs on your scan tool? They are the way the computer is determining if it should start controlling fuel or if it should go after its base chart that it had in there already. So in open loop, the computer's running off of that base chart that was programmed, and it's going to look at load and RPM and those excuse me, RPM, load, and those kind of things to determine how much fuel to add. But in closed loop, when the vehicle says, okay, my oxygen sensors are warm, they're responding, they look good, I'm going to go ahead and go into closed loop, and I'm going to trust those sensors, and I'm going to start adjusting the amount of fuel this thing gets because I want it to run stoichiometric. So the vehicle watches those, and then it starts to trim fuel, either positive, adding fuel, or negative, taking it away. A vehicle stuck in open loop. Certain failures on a vehicle can cause a vehicle to be stuck in open loop. So you'll see on the scan tool that it never even gets a chance to go into closed loop. You can find that information looking up the DTC info and that kind of thing to see what DTCs will keep it in closed loop. But typically, if a vehicle is stuck in open loop, the computer's doing everything it can just to keep it running at that point. Also, when you're doing testing, wide open throttle will make that computer go back into open loop. It will not be able to respond fast enough, I suppose, at high RPM, so it goes back to its base fuel strategy in open loop under wide open throttle. This is an ignition timing map, so we're talking fuel trims, we're talking fuel mapping. The ignition timing happens the same way. But again, you can see everything is changing depending on RPM and load and at different times. So guys, when you're looking at fuel trim failures, when you're looking at fuel trim codes, check your freeze frames, because that will tell you at what RPM, at what load, at what temperature that the vehicle failed at. These kind of charts really help to point that out, because you can see everything is different depending on what percentage load you are, depending on what RPM you're at. These are fuel control maps. These are open loop fuel control. We start here at 500 RPM, 0% load, 14.7 to 1 fuel ratio. As we up in our RPM and up in our load in the opposite corner, this programmer decided to program in 11.47 as the fuel trim in open loop on this vehicle. And another fuel chart operates the same way. Low RPM, low load, we're at a 14 air-fuel ratio. High RPM, high load, 10.2. So this is all open loop programming, and that's just those fuel charts, and it really shows you different RPMs and loads are going to give you different results. So like I said, make sure you're watching those freeze frames for that information. Here up on the screen, I just have a screen grab off of our GTO of starting up the vehicle. We're idling. Coolant is relatively cold. We're just over 100 degrees, and we're stuck here in open loop. And you can see our air-fuel ratio starting to ratchet up. We start off relatively rich, just under 13 to 1, and we increasingly get leaner and leaner as we warm up. Vehicle enters into closed loop, and we're sitting at a nice and steady 14.6 to 1 air-fuel ratio. So this engine's running just about stoichiometric. Okay, fuel trimming by the numbers. Back in the 80s, we had GMs telling us 128, 0, 256, and anywhere in the middle. Lower numbers would be a rich mixture, it's taking away fuel. Higher numbers, a lean mixture, adding fuel. On OBD2 world, we have gone ahead and turned those into percentages. So at 0% or 128, we're sitting steady right at 14.7 to 1. That's our sweet spot. That's where we want to be. When we drop below that, so let's say we're at negative 20, we are now subtracting away fuel. We're taking fuel away. The computer says, hey, we're running rich. I'm noticing a rich condition. Let's take away fuel and see if we can correct this. Same thing with running lean. It's going to add fuel. Short-term and long-term fuel trims. So short terms are just as they sound. They're almost immediate, they're short-term, and they're constantly going to be moving. They're a direct reflection of our O2 sensors. And for those of you guys that know where we're kind of getting with O2s, that's going to be the next class. Next month, we're going to talk on O2 sensors, their operation. We're going to scope some, graph some O2 sensors, wide bands, and show how to diagnose O2 sensors. That's going to be the next class. So just stick with us. So I'm not going to talk much on O2s. Okay, back to this. Long-term is going to be our learned fuel trim. That's going to be the computer taking the short-term into effect and adjusting over the long-term. Now, if you look at your scan tool and you just turn the key on, you'll almost always see short-terms at 0. Short-terms are always going to reset when the key is turned off. Long-terms, on the other hand, are a learned value. Typically, if the key is shut off, you turn it back on, you'll see your long-terms sitting right where they were before. So on our GTO right now, if I were to turn our key on, because we're running lean, our long terms are sitting at positive 25 on both banks, and our short terms would both be at 0. But if I start that vehicle up, you're going to see our short terms start to ratchet up and start to add more fuel, right around the 15% or so mark. So, another example. If a computer sees negative 15 constantly, so it's running rich, it wants to subtract fuel, seeing negative 15 on your short-term fuel trims, it's going to start to bring those long terms down. As the long terms go down, the short terms should react and go the opposite direction, and they should start to climb up. Okay? So your short terms starting to ratchet down, they hit maybe negative 15. Your short terms should be ratcheted back up, probably right around 0. The goal of the long terms fuel trims is to make those short-term fuel trims happy. It's to bring them back to 0. So I have a little infograph here. Oh, before I get to the infograph, here is just how quickly those short terms are moving compared to how steady the long terms are. You can see our short terms are bouncing like crazy. This is a 260-second window, bank 1 and bank 2. You can see they're moving all over the place between a 0% and a 4%, but most averaging between 3 and 1%. And our long terms, I know it's hard for you guys to see, but they're sitting here at a steady 9%. So our long terms are actually adding fuel. It's saying that our engine is running lean. And now this was before, this was on a good running engine. This had no check engine light on. This had no issues. This was before we ran into our lean issue. This is a known good capture. So our engine is running right now slightly lean, but it's happy. If you look, our long terms are steady. Our short terms are near 0. That means our engine is happy and it's running as close to stoichiometric as it can. It's happy at this point. And it's probably not setting a check engine light because it hasn't crossed over that threshold. Threshold on these engines in most vehicles is going to be that plus or minus 10 mark with a little bit of variance in there, but pretty commonly plus or minus 10 and above is going to set a check engine light on. So if we were to reset fuel trims on this vehicle, guys, if we were to bring this back down to 0 and reset it, start the vehicle up, we're going to see our short terms probably up around 15 or so, 12 to 15, because we were at 0 to 4 before. If we add that to our long terms, that's going to be our total trim. So right now, our total trim on this vehicle averages between 11 and 15-ish, give or take. So if we were to reset this to 0, our short terms would read about 15 or so until the long terms reacted and started to ratchet up and become 9 where they are now. All right, to explain this a little bit easier, let me bring this up first. I got this right here. So again, we have our percentages, we have our fuel trim table. You can see our long-term trims are sitting right around 0. This is where we want to be, right around our 0 mark. Our short terms are going to go usually plus or minus 10 or so. They're going to bounce back and forth like that, and they're always going to be moving. But if they start moving and they end up going low here, like down into the 30s and 40s, negative, that is where an issue starts. So they're going to bounce around here for a little while until the computer reacts and says, okay, let's bring those long-term trims down. Let's take fuel away long-term and try and bring those short terms back. So that's what we'll see here. Our long terms are going to adjust, and our short terms are back to their happy place. They're back to right around 0. In all reality, this engine is running very, very close to stoichiometric at this point, if not perfectly running, because the computer has been able to adapt itself. It's been able to adapt its fuel strategy that even though it has an issue, even though it's got a check engine light on, it is running very, very close to perfect. So let's go back here a couple, because I skipped some here. All right, just to help clear this up, because this all gets jumbled around in my head a little bit too, with all these numbers, air-fuel ratio, short-term, long-term, all these numbers doing different things. I like to remember it this way. Air-fuel ratio and lambda are going to work the opposite. Your air-fuel ratio goes up, your numbers go up, you're going to go lean. You're going to, if the number goes up, you're going to be taking fuel away. You're going to be taking fuel away. You're going to bring the fuel down. If the number goes down, you're going to be adding fuel. So if you go from 14.7 down to 10, you're adding fuel. The numbers go down, you're adding fuel. The numbers go up, you're taking away fuel. So air-fuel ratio and lambda work the opposite. O2 sensors. I know we didn't talk much on O2 sensors yet, but an O2 sensor over 450 millivolts is a rich condition. That's indicating rich, and an O2 sensor under 450 millivolts is indicating lean. Fuel trims are a little bit more simple, I think. Negative 25, we're subtracting, we're taking away, we're minusing fuel, we're taking away fuel. The engine said, hey, I have too much fuel, things aren't right, we're running rich right now, let's take that fuel away. We're minusing, we're subtracting. Positive, I like to put a plus in front of it. So on the scan tool, you'll probably see a 25. I like to just think of it in my head as having a plus in front of it. The computer is adding fuel at that point. It says, hey, we're running lean, there's not enough fuel in here, let's add some fuel to it and give us our positive number. Typically an engine with an air-fuel ratio issue will have opposite O2 sensor readings as the short-term or long-term fuel trim readings. So you have an O2 sensor pegged high, say you're reading 800 millivolts on the O2, typically you're going to see your fuel trims to be negative, like negative 20, negative 30, taking fuel away because the O2 sensor is saying the vehicle's running rich. Computer responds and subtracts fuel away. All right, we're back to this page. We can skip over this. So, we're almost done, guys. I know it's a lot of talking today. How does this all happen? How does the computer make all this happen? Well, in closed loop, it watches those O2 sensors, looks for changes. O2 sensors are constantly going to be moving, and it watches them and increases or decreases the fuel trims, which increase or decrease the injector pulse width, or the on time of the fuel injector. So on a good running engine, say it wants to do 2 millisecond on time, if the thing's running lean, it's going to add fuel. It's going to leave that injector open just a little bit longer, maybe 2.5 seconds now. And then just the opposite for a rich condition. It's going to close up that injector quicker. It's going to be only open maybe a millisecond and a half. So that's how the computer is going to control the fuel. And then last but not least, guys, the last slide. Results of the fuel trims being skewed for an extended period of time. So you're driving around, the check engine light's on, the thing's running like crap. This is what can happen. Both rich and lean, you can cause catalytic converter damage. The chemical imbalance, the chemicals that are needed, oxygen, fuel, all that stuff needed to create the event inside of the cat is off. It can cause meltdown on both ends, rich or lean. Typically, a lean engine runs into more problems. You can get detonation, you can get internal engine damage, an overheating problem, or and excessive NOx gas production. Rich conditions, typically engines like to run a little bit more rich. Tuners are going to program your engine a little bit more rich. That's just the way they want to be. It's worse for the environment, but it's better for the engine. Fuel contamination in the oil. You can thin out the oil if it's running excessively rich. That is going to cut down on the lubrication principles of the oil, and you could cause cylinder damage, valve damage, anything that having oil that doesn't lubricate as well affects. You're going to get that rotten egg fuel smell. You're going to see some spark plug fouling, and you're going to get excessive hydrocarbon output if you're putting a sniffer in the tailpipe. So, all right, guys. That is going to be it for this one. You can see fuel trims 2. That's going to be our next class. That's where we're going to talk about O2 sensors, how they factor into all this, what they do, how they work, and we're going to do some testing with O2s. So I guess at this point, guys, let's see all the comments, and hopefully I didn't put anybody to sleep. All right, we got some good answers here. All right, well, let's see if you guys are right. So the question, guys, was Technician A says a positive 25 long-term fuel trim and a negative 25 short-term should not be driven and needs to be fixed as soon as possible. That's not the case. Remember, long-term is a learned value, short-term is immediate. So long-term says, okay, we need to add fuel. Short-term says, whoa, we have way too much fuel, let's back off. The computer's fighting against itself. Typically, this happens when somebody fixes a problem where it was adding fuel before and they didn't clear out the keep alive memory or the codes. So, Technician A, incorrect. Technician B, a stoichiometric mixture provides optimal performance for a gas engine. Also incorrect, like I said. You want to be around that 12.5 or so mark for optimal performance. Let's see what we have. A bunch of you guys saying hi. I did respond to a bunch of your comments before the video. Arbez Auto, both banks lean. If nothing obvious shows up in the scan data and the boot between the throttle bending and the airflow meter isn't split, smoke it. Yep, exactly. You can use smoke to test out your intake manifold for leaks. We got JS Myrtle going with D. Arbez Auto going with D. So you guys are both right. And Roy also saying D. So go ahead, throw my email up on the screen there. Nice. Go ahead and send me out an email, guys, with your t-shirt size, mailing address, and remember the color of your t-shirt has to be in there now too, either gray, blue, or black, and then I'll get one of those out to you right away. We got Woodshop42 saying B, and Gerardo also going with B. That is going to be incorrect because a stoichiometric mixture is just optimal for emissions. We got Bob coming in from Hayward's Automotive. He's saying D, neither also. Perfect. So again, send me out an email with your shirt. Arbiz Auto, you misspoke about the temp sensor. If it was reading low, it would create a rich condition. Yes, that's correct. I must have said that wrong. If a temp sensor is reading low, say -40, it's going to fatten up the mixture. It's going to make it more rich because a colder engine does need more fuel. One thing that always came to mind that I can remember was guys with like the Pontiac Grand Ams and stuff. They would actually skew their coolant temp sensor or their intake air temp sensor to create the vehicle thinking it was cold so that they could get more fuel and also create harsher shifts. So that's just how temp sensors can affect things. Pablo says, hi from Spain. Well, hi Pablo, hi from Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. Caesar came on and just gave us a little dash mark. Not sure what that's supposed to be. JS Myrtle says, good explanation. Bob came on and says, great job. It's enjoyable to watch you teach and explain things so your viewers can understand how the computer reacts in open and closed loop. Thank you, Bob. I appreciate that. I try to always explain things to you guys from the beginning because without knowing how the system functions, without knowing where to start, you can't just dive headfirst into the vehicle. You end up chasing your tail most of the time. So if we know how the system reacts, we know how the systems function, first of all, we know how to diagnose it quicker and more efficiently, and in a technician's world, that's what it's all about. We want to be faster, we want to be more efficient, less comebacks, less time on the vehicle equals more money for us. And our last question, Jonathan Dean asking, what does a blue flag behind you represent? Well, unfortunately, this is the only backdrop we have at the moment. Good old 1848 represents the Wisconsin flag. If I'm going to take the camera here, guys, just bear with me, I'll show you. There we are. Good old Wisconsin. So that is that. I think that's going to be about it for today, guys. I love all the feedback from you guys, all the comments, all the interaction that you guys are giving me is just awesome. Any of you guys that were watching today that are Spanish primary speakers, Fritz is going to do this exact same presentation in Espanol in 2 weeks on Wednesday in 2 weeks. So make sure you guys who speak Spanish are here for that. Otherwise, I think that's about it for me, guys. Again, if you're liking what you see, give us a thumbs up. Comment on the video, ask questions. I always go out and answer them for you guys as best of my knowledge, or send me out an email. You know, I always try to get back to your emails as fast as I can. So great having you guys there. Without you guys being there, we would not be here. So we'll see you guys in February for our O2 sensor class. And until then, cheers.